questions. So this is a very special day for us because Jill is coming in from the San Rafael branch of Pasadena Public Library. Jill lives in Pasadena and is able to walk from her home to the San Rafael Library. So when they set up the Pasadena Public Libraries, the concept was that everyone would be able to walk to their local library. So this is a perfect example of today. So Jill is a former wine and food editor and writer. She's the author of 2 memoirs, Finding Pete, Rediscovering the Brother I Lost in Vietnam, published in 2009, and For Want of Wings, A Bird with Teeth and a Dinosaur in the Family, published in 2022. Jill has spoken about her wonderful book, For Want of Wings, last month, and we are delighted to be able to invite her back today. Finding Pete is a memoir chronicling the author's brother, Pete Hunting, a non-combat worker with International Voluntary Services who was killed in an ambush in 1965. Thus becoming one of the first American civilian casualties of the Vietnam War. Over the years, Jill's quest to connect with her older brother led her to overcome her family's silence, discover Pete's lost letters, and visit the place where he died. On November 12, 1965, Walter Cronkite announced that civilian aid worker Peter Hunting had been killed by Viet Cong agents in the Mekong Delta. For Hunting's 15-year-old sister, Jill, it was the beginning of a lifetime of questions that she will be telling us about and are detailed in her book. It's a personalized account of a critical moment in U.S. history, as well as the moving story of an altruistic youth who personifies what America lost in Vietnam. So we are delighted to be able to welcome Jill today to Pasadena Public Library and participating in our Authors and Their Journey series. Welcome, Jill.
Thank you, Christine. It's so nice to be with you. And hello to all of you who are on Zoom or watching this at a later date on YouTube. And I want to also thank Tiffany Dueños, who's the tech person working behind the scenes, who designed the slides that you will see. This is a commemoration of Asian American and Pacific Islanders Heritage Month. And so when we think about the Asian American experience in this country, we can't overlook the painful chapters in our history that are part of that. One of these was the war in Vietnam, which, as Christine has said, is the context of Finding Pete. So today I'm going to talk about 2 of my author journeys. First, the journey that led to Finding Pete being published. And I'll also talk about how Ken Burns and Lynn Novick came to include Pete in their PBS film series, The Vietnam War. It is a perfect illustration of what Shakespeare wrote in Cymbeline. Fortune brings in some boats that are not steered. Second, I'll talk about my journey to learn the circumstances of my brother's death in Vietnam. He was the first American civilian aid worker killed in the conflict. His death was brutal and widely reported, and my family didn't talk about it. The circumstances were mysterious. And for the benefit of people who haven't read this book and would like to, I will not give away the ending, but I can say that what I learned put to rest years of wondering. Finding Pete was my first book and was published in 2009. I had not set out to write a memoir or even to write about Pete. I'd planned to write a book about truffles, the wild delicacy that grows underground and is hunted by pigs and dogs. I was working as a food and wine writer and editor in Sonoma and Napa, California, and my book idea was to profile interesting characters in the truffle world, including truffle hunters and chefs and planters trying to grow truffles on a commercial scale in the United States. I had spoken with a literary agent who thought I should write about who would be the first to succeed at growing truffles successfully. That was not my kind of book. I have never been interested in the competition for celebrity and wealth. I tell the whole story in the book, and I spoke about it in a previous talk with the library, which Christine mentioned. But briefly, I went to Italy on a retreat with a group of food writers, and I came away committed to writing a book that had been waiting for me for a long, long time. That book became Finding Pete. I had written magazine and newspaper articles before, but not a book. So I applied to the Breadloaf Writers Conference in Vermont, and there I workshopped a first chapter, and I attended lectures and classes morning, noon, and night in a crash course in the craft of writing a book. When I left Breadloaf to return to Sonoma, where I lived at the time, I overheard some people in the airport talking about the conference. One of them said, "If I ever hear the words narrative arc again, I'm going to scream." At Breadloaf, terms like narrative arc and character arc are thrown around like green and purple beads at Mardi Gras. At Breadloaf, I also met the literary agent who represented me for Finding Pete. How I got an agent was a Cinderella story. I was Cinderella. My agent showed my book proposal to 2 or 3 rounds of editors who turned it down. Then one morning, I woke up with the words alternating chapters in my mind. I took the chapter outline from my book proposal, cut it apart with scissors, and taped it back together, alternating chapters about Pete with chapters about my quest to learn what had happened to him. I thought that this structure could work, and I called my agent. She liked the idea. I have never told her that it came to me in a dream. My decision to write Finding Pete ushered in a series of remarkable coincidences. First, I found my brother's 64 letters from Vietnam, which my mother had told me were all lost. The letters led me to Pete's college friends, his IVS teammates in Vietnam, his college girlfriend who had saved every note and letter he had ever written to her, and the woman Pete hoped to marry, whom I had tried to find for many years. With all the letters these people shared with me, I eventually had 175 letters that Pete wrote from Vietnam. In my brother's smart and often very funny letters, I found him. After Finding Pete was published in 2009, the surprises kept coming. One morning, my phone rang and the caller ID said New York City. I thought it was a sales call and I didn't answer. I forgot about it all day. And then that evening, I listened to the message. The caller was from Ken Burns and Lynn Novick's production company. "We have your book here and we'd like to talk to you," a voice said. I went to New York and spent a morning at Florentine Films talking about the project they were just beginning. They were interested in Pete's letters and Walter Cronkite's announcement of his death on the CBS Evening News. CBS had sent me the transcript of that program, but because their headquarters had moved several times, the film had been lost. I chose excerpts from Pete's letters and sent the producers his films from Vietnam, which only my immediate family had ever seen. The Finding Pete project took on a life of its own, and it changed my outlook. I learned to expect coincidences. I got used to uncertainty. I learned to rely on my intuition. I came to see history as non-linear and full of dots, there for the connecting. At Wesleyan University, Pete majored in government and minored in Chinese. As one of the Kennedy generation, he responded to the young president's appeal to ask what you can do for your country. I was in 6th grade when Pete graduated and left for Vietnam with IVS, International Voluntary Services, a forerunner of the Peace Corps. The United States had no combat troops in Southeast Asia then, only military advisors. Pete thought of going to Vietnam to teach English as a great adventure. The situation in Vietnam was already dangerous, but most Americans didn't realize that, let alone understand the country's complicated politics. One of the first IVS volunteers in Vietnam told me he saw 2 coffins draped with American flags being loaded onto an airplane. The dead were advisors who had been killed by liberation soldiers. It was 1959, 4 years before Pete arrived in Vietnam, and 6 years before President Johnson sent combat troops. IVS was a humanitarian organization that sent college-educated men and women to developing countries as teachers and agriculture workers. They supplied hamlet farmers with new breeds of pigs. They introduced varieties of strawberries and watermelons that were suited to Vietnam's different climates. They taught science and health in the schools. The volunteers were required to study the language of the country where they were posted. Pete had a soft ear, and having studied Chinese, he picked up Vietnamese quickly. He was friendly, and he learned to communicate with the Cham and Montagnard people, 2 of Vietnam's ethnic minorities, in their own language. He worked in about a dozen hamlets and sank wells in several of them. After 2 years in coastal Ninh Thuan province, Pete was transferred to the Mekong Delta. He wrote about it in a letter. This is an interesting section of the country. Perhaps 50% of the people are Cambodian Vietnamese. The Vietnamese had just finished colonizing this area when the French started coming in. There are all sorts of religious sects with their different pagoda architectural styles. Down here, they have a fascinating way of making manure. The people make a huge, tall tower out of bamboo with a palm frond roof. Instead of a floor, they hang about 50 bundles of palm fronds tied at the end, like drying tobacco. After a few days, thousands of bats will appear, big ones, 6 inches to a foot from wingtip to wingtip, sleeping up in the tower during the day. In the evening, the people come out and broom the guano to one side. It makes excellent fertilizer. Just goes to show you what people can do without science and industry. When Pete was transferred to the Mekong Delta, he wrote to my grandmother that it would be safer. It was not. One day he was driving in his Jeep to look in on another IVS teammate. He came upon a slow-moving army convoy and waved as he passed them. Within minutes, he was ambushed. Walter Cronkite and others reported that Pete was led to his death by friends who betrayed him. For 40 years, I wondered if it were true, and if it were true, why? As anyone whose loved one has met a violent end knows, you want to know what happened. Somehow, knowing helps. I'll read one more excerpt from the book. I made 2 trips to Vietnam. In 2006, I traveled with 2 former GIs who were building libraries. I asked if we could look for a hamlet that Pete had mentioned in a letter. Its women were superb weavers. We managed to find the hamlet, which was extremely remote. We turned onto smaller and smaller dirt roads until we saw a loom, 2 young women, and colorful weavings hanging on a rack. Our group included the 2 American library builders, a Vietnamese interpreter named Song, a driver, and me. No sooner had we stepped out of the van than our leader realized he had left behind a suitcase containing all his documents and cash for the next library. I'll pick this up in the book. Suddenly, Chuck realized that he had left a suitcase behind at our hotel in Phan Rang, some 20 minutes back. There was no time to waste, and in an instant he was in the van and the driver was pulling away. I bought several weavings, and Song and I meandered across the road to the home of another weaver. I purchased a silk runner and took a picture of the woman warping the thread. For no apparent reason, it was much hotter on this side of the road, So Song suggested we go back to the first place and wait there for Chuck. We rejoined Jim to find that the sisters were negotiating a marriage proposal. They had offered him a dowry of 5 water buffaloes. It was blazing hot, and I glanced around for a chair. By now, a third older sister had arrived who spoke better English. She motioned to a low cot in the shade and offered me a seat. We sat down together. If Chuck had been with us, he would have been in a hurry, and what came next would never have happened. But he would not return for a good half hour, and there was nothing to do but bide the time. Looking toward the weavings inside, I told the young woman that my brother had bought blankets like these 40 years ago. I had one at home. He had helped a woman sell her weavings. He had lived in Phan Rang. She said her mother and grandmother had a good American friend a long time ago, before the soldiers came. My mother say he speak our Cham language, she said. I knew Pete spoke some Cham. My antenna went up. He was tall, she said, and the way her mother described the color of his hair, it was just like mine. She said he had a high nose. Song was standing nearby. She meant a straight nose, not flat like some Cham and Vietnamese peoples, he corrected. I thought he was too polite to let me think she meant a big nose. He had come here on his motorcycle, she continued. One day he told her mother to put all of the weavings into the biggest basket she had. Then he took her to a Cham temple to sell them. She was afraid to go, but he told her it would be all right. You come with me, he told her. They rode to Poklonggarai Temple, which Song had shown us the previous day. She sold everything in her basket. The young woman, whose name I now knew was Calm, told me, sometimes my mother say, it too dangerous for you, but he say, I don't care, I take you. Come with me. I turned to Song. Are you listening to this? Yes, he nodded, clearly amazed. Calm remembered more of her mother's stories about Pete. Sometimes he brought a live chicken or two with him. When he first started coming to the hamlet, she said, he very thin. I thought of his first months when he missed American desserts and McDonald's hamburgers. When Calm's father saw Pete coming on his motorcycle, he would call out, here come Blue Eyes. Then she said, he'd go away and he never come back. Hearing the question in her voice, I told her Pete had moved to the Mekong Delta and had been killed there. She raised her hand to cover her open mouth. Chuck and our driver pulled up. I went to the van, opened my suitcase, and removed Pete's picture. When I handed it to Calm, she looked at his face and back to mine. This is for your mother, I said. Please tell her Pete's sister came back. So, as this is a library talk, I'll close with a story about a library in Vietnam. Pete and his IVS teammates and friends of our family approached my parents about creating a memorial of some kind. They built a library in Phan Rang where Pete lived for 2 years. Here is the library on the day it was dedicated. In the picture of 3 women sitting at a table, the woman in the foreground is wearing an áo dài, the traditional garment worn by Vietnamese women. Phan Rang was not a great center of learning like Hue or Hanoi. It had never had a library. When it opened, people could hardly believe they could take books home to read for free. In 1991 and 2006, I looked for the old library. It was long gone, but the city does now have a modern library and even some of the books from the original building. The last slide is a quotation from my book. When I wrote the words, the passing of that moment, I was referring to a time of optimism in the United States. During my brother's years in Vietnam, our country had its problems, but we had not experienced the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert Kennedy. We cannot return to a more innocent time. Still, because I found 175 lost letters, and not everyone is so fortunate, I can say that I consider myself lucky. Thank you all for being here. And Christine, do we have any questions?
Thank you very much, Jill. What a wonderful, wonderful presentation. And thank you for sharing stories about your brother. And that was especially heartwarming about the one with the weaving and someone that actually knew your brother and how altruistic he was and helpful. What a wonderful opportunity for you. It must have made the whole trip exceptionally special.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a beautiful presentation. And I want to remind everyone that we do have Jill's book, Finding Pete, in the Pasadena Public Library. We have 4 copies. And if you want to check it out, please go to your library or call and put it on hold and go and pick it up. So we do have some comments in the chat. Most of them are saying, very moving, beautiful presentation. Hello, how are you? So tell us a little bit about how you worked this out with your publisher. And you published this in 2009. So this was pre-pandemic. Your For Want of Wings was during the pandemic, which made it a little bit more difficult. Did you write this in one sitting down? Did you write it over days? It must have been a very emotional journey to have been able to write this book.
Well, I was still working as a food and wine journalist in Northern California. And I felt like I was watching a tennis match. I was writing the book, and then I'm writing about wine and food and winemakers. And then I'm back to the book, and I began to think that this was just too hard. I wasn't going to be able to do it. So I was on a contract to write for a place in the Napa Valley. And when the contract ended, I just said, all right, I'm just gonna fly on the trapeze and just start writing this book. And that's what I did. And I mentioned that I found an agent. It was a Cinderella story. This agent took me on. And the way I found my publisher, Wesleyan University Press, was that there was a reunion meeting of Pete's classmates, and they invited me to come to their meeting and talk about Pete. And when I did, I met the publisher and the editor-in-chief at Wesleyan University Press, and I just loved her. We just really hit it off at first sight, and she wanted that book. So I called my agent and said, I found an editor I'd like to work with, and you may know or guess that university publishers do not pay as much as a big New York house, but I loved this editor, and I thought it was so right that Wesleyan, where Pete attended, would be the publisher. So that's how that went, and I had a wonderful experience with them. Their forte at Wesleyan Press is dance and poetry, and I was very far away from that. So they published the book. They gave me a beautiful book. I had a great experience. I eventually got the rights back myself because they weren't doing much with it, but that's really the way publishing is. Oh, and if I may say one more thing, the library, the Pasadena Library, also has, can you see? This is the set of DVDs of the Vietnam War by Ken Burns and Lynn Novick. And the library also has the companion book to check out.
So thank you very much. There are lots of wonderful pictures in the book as well. And there is an index and notes. So it is very well documented, and it's really a good accounting of everything that happened in these unfortunate events. Someone wants to know, were you able to bring your brother home in 1965?
Yes. Okay, this is going to be a little gruesome for some. I apologize. That early in the American war in Vietnam, I've been told that means of refrigeration of dead soldiers was not as advanced as it became. And because there weren't that many casualties as came later. And here's Pete, a civilian. And what they did is they took his body to Saigon. Uh, he was put in some kind of refrigeration, and then he was flown home on a plane with other casualties of the war. And the plane came into Hartford, Connecticut. My family is from Connecticut, and most of my relatives live there, although my immediate family lived at the time in Oklahoma City. So we flew on a government cargo plane, I think, to Connecticut. My mother went to meet the plane in Hartford, and then Pete's body was prepared for burial, and he is buried just outside New Haven in Woodbridge, Connecticut.
Thank you very much for telling us that. So somebody mentions that the library was removed to make way for a street per local Van Rang residents, and several IVsers helped with the construction of the library, including, and they named them, that were friends of your brothers, Beryl Dara, I'm not pronouncing that correctly, I'm sure, I apologize, Jay Scarborough, and perhaps others. And also the person that sent this, Chuck Cable.
Hi, Chuck.
Yeah, so you never actually got to see the original library. You just have a picture of it, as I understand, because when you went there, they had redone it.
That's right. And in fact, several of us got in trouble on my first trip to Vietnam trying to go see the library. And I was with 4 former IVSers who spoke Vietnamese. I did not. And we went into a village looking for a windmill that Pete had built. He had designed and built it. And we were told it was still standing. And we went to this village, and people started asking questions, and these Vietnamese speaking Americans looked suspicious. And so we never got any farther on our desire to find the library. We eventually paid large fines, but so that first time we didn't get to see it. And on my second trip, the Vietnamese I was with were very open and friendly. By this time, of course, we had American diplomatic relations with Vietnam again, and they were lovely hosts. They showed us where Pete would have lived and the location of the library, but never got to see that. And as soon as we determined we couldn't find the library, our host said, well, let us show you the new library. And so we went and saw that and met the lovely librarian there, and had a very nice reception. But no, I never got to see it.
Well, that was a lovely ending to see what actually they had started, and then came to a wonderful library, because they weren't used to checking out books for free. So you really started a wonderful thing in his memory, wonderfully. So several of the people in the chat are actually telling us where the different events were. They remember where it was, and some of them want you to know that this wasn't the high point of his interactions with the Vietnamese. So he was very Pete, very creative about building things. Did he grow up as a builder? Was your father someone that was extremely inventive, or did he study that in high school?
My father and brother both had high mechanical aptitude. My father was a pilot with the FAA, and his field was flight safety. And from the time Pete was little, he was building things. He built soapbox racing cars. He built an enormous, I think it was 8 foot high box kite and flew it. And that was covered by a reporter from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. We were living in Missouri at the time. And he had a motorcycle. It was always broken down. He was always working on it. So he liked drawing things, building things, and he was pretty good at it. And my father was the same way. It did not come down to me.
So what's also very special about this author talk that you're presenting is that you've been able to contact and several of the people that were with your brother in Vietnam that time,
Yes.
and you've been able to correspond with them through all of your research with the hunting through the letters, going back to Wesleyan. That was quite a project.
Yes, and none of these men in IVS who were volunteers in Vietnam has ever said this to me, but I know what they all think. And they think, you're Pete's little sister, you're our little sister. That's how they treat me. And several of them are on the call here. And that comment from Mark Bonacci about Don Luce. Don Luce was the in-country director of International Voluntary Services and resigned his position when U.S. involvement was just made the work untenable, and became a very outspoken and important anti-war activist in the United States.
Oh, thank you very much. So your sisters, you had two sisters.
Yes.
And so were they supportive with you, and was your mother supportive with you for all of your research?
My sisters were very supportive. They were glad I was writing the book and doing the research, because just like me, they didn't know what had happened to Pete too either. And I dedicated the book to my two sisters. My mother was alive at the time I was working on this, but she had dementia, and she really had withheld these letters from my sisters and me. But when they told her I was writing the book, it was as if, this possessiveness she had just been sandpapered away. And she, in fact, was supportive, or not, I should say supportive. She was glad I was doing it. I never spoke to her about it.
Oh, so someone wants to know if you could ask your brother one question. What would you ask your brother?
I like that question. I oftentimes I oftentimes wonder what Pete would advise me about something. I have a husband who I can always turn to and ask for good advice, but sometimes I ask my brother in my imagination, why are my sisters behaving this way? And I even imagine what he would say, but I probably shouldn't say that here.
Okay. So you used to live in Sonoma, and then you're no longer, you're a former wine and food editor. Are you still involved with that at all? Or
I am on the receiving end of bottles of wine from time to time.
that's very nice.
I'm not doing any more of that. I have done it for a long time, and lately I was doing some writing for a winery in Santa Barbara County. And when the pandemic came, and I was also doing quite a bit of editing for a winery with a restaurant in Sonoma. And I loved the work and I loved the people I worked with. But when the pandemic came, their business started falling off. And I saw it as a time when things were slowing down for me, and I could actually finish this new book for want of wings. And so So that's what I did with my pandemic time. But I'm not really involved in wine and food anymore, but I do stay in touch to the extent that a lot of friends of mine in Sonoma and Napa have been affected by the wildfires. And some of them have had fires come very, very close to their homes, or they've lost vineyards and so forth. So I know among the Californians on this call, it's a concern we all have. When the wind comes up, people think about fires. So my heart really goes out to all those people. And but personally, in terms of writing or editing about food and wine, I'm not doing that now.
So are you looking for another book? Have you found another book to write about?
I have some ideas, but nothing that's really developed yet. What I would really like to do is record one or both of these books for audio, and I haven't worked out how I'll do that yet, or if I'll do it, but that would be my next project.
Oh, okay. So, because each of these books, Finding Pete is about your brother, and For Want of Wings is about your grandfather. So maybe you have another family member too that that would be make for an equally interesting memoir.
I actually do, and I'll just keep this very brief. I have another ancestor who was Abraham Lincoln's last appointment before he was assassinated, and he was appointed to be a federal judge in Montana Territory, and he was a lifelong resident of New Haven, Connecticut, and he sent his law books out there, and they did not have any laws to speak of. They had vigilante justice. So he's kind of an interesting character, but I'm not really moved yet to write about him. I'm sorry, what was your other question?
Whether or not you had something
Oh,
else that you wanted to write a memoir about, because those are very special journeys to write a memoir about your family and really to dwell into it. So also someone wants to know, did you go to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C.?
Yes, I've been there a number of times, and probably a lot of you have been there too, or seen the traveling exhibit. Let's see, I think it was the second time I went. I went because this library builder I mentioned, the man building libraries in Vietnam, told me that they were going to read all the names of the 58,000 and some people on the wall. And it was an anniversary, maybe the 25th, not sure about that number. And he said anyone could read names. So I wrote to the director, Jan Scruggs, and asked if I could read names on the anniversary. And I explained that my brother's name is not on the wall because he was a civilian and a non-combatant, but that I would like to read names of men who were killed the same week as Pete. So he sent me a list, and I went to Washington, and I waited in line, and there are people waiting to go up to a microphone, and a woman in front of me turned and said, "Oh, you're reading names too, and what service was your brother with?" And I said, "Oh, well, he was a civilian. He didn't serve in the military." And she just threw her arms around me and embraced me. So I was very glad to do that. There was a time in my college years when I was an anti-warrior, marched in demonstrations, was very personally affected by the war in Vietnam because of my brother. And I didn't understand military service in Vietnam, but through my friend Chuck, who is building libraries, I came to understand his service, and he and I made peace with the fact that we had different points of view, but that we had so much more in common than we did not have in common. And he taught me to say to servicemen, "Thank you for your service." So that was a growing experience for me.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Also, you proposed the Book of Remembrance, if I'm correct, a sculpture in memory of civilians killed in the war. The book, in which are symbolic inscribed the names of non-combatant victims of violent conflict, will be a permanent installation for the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C. Was that actually completed, or is that there? Did you go to that unveiling, or?
That was not completed. I had the idea and I proposed it to the U.S. Institute of Peace, and which has been described to me as a think tank for the State Department. And it was while the Institute was being constructed, and I had a lot of meetings there, and I had a sculpture, and she had arranged to have this large bronze cast, but it just really wasn't a priority for the Peace Institute. They were interested in the project, but they kept moving the placement of it on their property to less and less important places. And they didn't, my idea was for a closed book inside of which the names are known only to the creator. And they wanted to have an electronic means of entering names of people, and they were really getting away from the idea of the simplicity of the book. And then they wanted to put it in an area where the public could not go, and it more or less fizzled out at that point. But people have said to me, you know, maybe someday, somewhere, there will be a place for this Book of Remembrance in honor of all civilians killed in war. So I don't know if that's going to be my dream, but it might be somebody's dream.
But you never know whether it will happen, and sometime it will happen. And then, just as you went to the Vietnam War Memorial, you can go and see this and participate in reading the names. So you've had a very moving and a very personal journey discovering your brother and what he did in Vietnam and about his death. And so I'm sure it's an exceptionally emotional thing to even talk about and share with us today. So we thank you for your time and effort to share it. It's a beautifully written book, and I hope everyone has the opportunity to check it out at the Pasadena Public Library. You can also purchase a copy from Vroman's bookstore. And I do want to tell you, and you can tell us a little bit about your other book, For Want of Wings, A Bird with Teeth and a Dinosaur in the Family. It's quite a fascinating story as well. And we, of course, have this at the Pasadena Public Library for you to check out as well. So do you want to say, we have just a few minutes if you want to tell us something about that. It's a fascinating story as well.
Oh, thank you. For Want of Wings, the title comes from a description of an 83 million year old avian dinosaur that my great-grandfather found. It was a bird that had wings many millions of years ago, and over time it lost the ability to fly, and it became a diving bird and a swimmer. So For Want of Wings was part of the description by the American paleontologist O.C. Marsh, who started the first paleontology department in the United States at Yale. And so I learned that my great-grandfather, Thomas H. Russell, was a 20-year-old member of this Yale expedition in 1872. He was 20 years old, and in an incredible case of beginner's luck, he found this dinosaur that has been called the least known of one of the most famous dinosaurs ever discovered. And so yes, somebody's showing the picture. Can everyone see that picture? Or can I see it? Oh, there it is.
You're right there.
Okay, thank you. So on the lower left, the man wearing all the bullets at his waist is my great-grandfather. And he did not become a paleontologist. He went back to New Haven, where he lived his entire life, and went to medical school, and became a very hardworking, non-glory seeking surgeon and professor of surgery. But the man standing in the center is the paleontologist O.C. Marsh. And if you've ever heard of the Bone Wars, that was a war between rival paleontologists, and this was one of them. So the book is about my investigation into, thank you, that particular expedition from Yale is the least known of the 4 expeditions from Yale. And I wanted to know about it and try to understand what my ancestor might have thought and felt when he found this rare fossil in Western Kansas. So that's what that's about.
Well, it's a wonderful book too. And I need to be corrected. I did say your grandfather, and I should have said your great-grandfather when I was talking about it. But these are 2 wonderful memoirs. The one, Finding Pete, is a journey that helps everyone understand the Vietnam War better, and also that group of young men that went to help and set up. How many were in that group of young men that were there?
Oh dear, I should know that.
There must have been a lot, and so
it was a lot. Young men and women.
And women too. Well, they were very altruistic.
Yes.
And this is a very poignant story that you have shared with us, and we appreciate your time and your journey as an author to be part of our Authors and Their Journey series, and also during the month of May for Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So thank you very much, Jill. And
thank you, Christine.
And it was delightful to have you speaking from the San Rafael Library. And as she lives in the San Rafael area of Pasadena, and we'll look forward to your next book, which will be equally as well researched.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So nice to be with you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.